Namaste, everyone. Namaste. Thank you so much for joining. Today, Sankrant Sanu was supposed to be joining me on this session, but unfortunately, he's been caught up last minute. So I'm afraid he won't be joining. But I thought I'll take the opportunity to just give my thoughts on the topic we were going to discuss anyway, and actually then give the opportunity to you or my viewers to please ask me any questions that you may have of me. I haven't done many sort of these question and answer sessions in a little while. So if you have any burning questions for me about, what's it like to be a Hindu in the UK, about my life story, about how baby Hiramba is doing, feel free to ask, please. So before we begin, if you wouldn't mind, please, liking the video, subscribing if you haven't already, sharing it if at the end you feel it's worthwhile sharing. That will really help. And it obviously it gives me motivation to make more and more videos. So yes, the topic of discussion that was meant to be with Sankrantji today was on, why do Hindus say certain things? And I see, Vedic warrior ji is here. Pranam ji. Yes, why do Hindus say certain things? So this was back on the topic about the English language, the problem of the English language for Hindus, for India, etc. And this is a problem that's not going away. I see it only getting worse, in fact. I have heard that there are ideas to make it more compulsory to study in a regional language, and I've seen some sort of surveys going about asking how that might be implemented. But let's face it, things are going in the opposite direction. When I speak to friends and family in India, they're turning more and more to English. I know people who are living in India and they don't speak one word of any of the native languages. They only speak English. They are living essentially as an expat in their own native country. And that's terribly sad, because then you're not actually living in your own country, are you? You're viewing it through an outsider's lens and judging your own country through that outsider's lens. Many people, not many people, some people, including some people that it surprises me sometimes when they say this, they don't realize the problem of speaking English that's bringing for Hindus and for India. And they say, well, language is just like a calculator. It's just a tool. Yes, it is just a language, but it's more than just like a tool. Because, there are some tools are better than other tools. Just like if you have a calculator, you might have like a child's calculator for doing just adding and dividing and multiplying, but then you have a scientific calculator for doing much more advanced computations, and then you have a laptop or a computer, a desktop computer, supercomputers for doing calculations. So yes, language is one entity of a subject, but there are many different qualities that can have that make some better than others, and particularly some better than others at describing, interpreting a culture. And as we know, the Hindu culture is so vastly different from the Western cultures. I know many people, they try and spin that the other way to seem that Hinduism is very inclusive. Yes, it is very inclusive. Of course it is. But at the same time, it does view the world in a certain way. And that is very different from how the Western world views the world, and what is right and what is wrong, and how society works. And the language is the sort of the vehicle of that knowledge, of that culture, and that passes from one generation to the next, embedding the ideas, the progressions in that culture as the language evolves. And of course, in the West, that cultural evolution was a Judeo-Christian evolution. And so the language evolved along those ideas. Whereas in India, the culture was Hindu and very different from the Abrahamic religions. On a very basic level, it is actually very different. That idea of all religions are the same, it's just complete nonsense. I see that in every video I do, I think. So the language is very different. And of course, that's not unique to the Indian languages. Every language is very different and represents its culture. For example, I read a paper about a native tribal group. I think it was in the Pacific Ocean somewhere, and they don't have words for left and right. They only have they use the words north, south, east, and west in all circumstances for describing, positional arrangements. So they would never say, the chair is left of the table. It would be, the chair is to the east of the table, because they have such an intuitive understanding of the directions, because they are so in tune with nature, with the direction of the setting, the rising sun, of the directions of waves in the ocean. And so for them, left and right is irrelevant, because they see the world through this lens of the directions within nature. And so that's a very clear example of how culture will help the language, or will instruct what words exist within a language, and vice versa. Because if you don't have those words, you would never then start to think, about left and right, because the words at your disposal are north, south, east, and west. And I'm sure there will be similar examples of this in the Indian languages compared to the Western languages. But my sense is that there's relatively less interest in understanding these sort of nuances compared to understanding these nuances in languages of other countries. Because unfortunately, as we know, not only is there a sort of reluctance within the Western mindset for accepting the damage that was done to India by the West, actually realizing that Hindus, that India are victims, which they absolutely are. They are the victims of genocide. They are the victims of not just physical genocide, but cultural genocide. And the West doesn't realize that. And one of the reasons, though, for that is because many Indians themselves don't realize that. Very sadly, and as we all know, that's a result of the education system and many things that really, really need to change. So yes, a big problem is that the West doesn't realize that the damage they have done needs to be acknowledged and could be researched and lead to publications, understanding how they are continuing, or how Indians are continuing to exert mental colonization on themselves by continuing to speak in the colonizer's language today. And similarly, Indians themselves need to realize that and make a change. So it really, as I said earlier, it really frustrates me when I learn or I see Indians not realizing the problem that the English language is causing them, and only sort of fawning over the English language. Because when I compare that to my own experiences here in the UK, it's just so radically different. Because here, speaking other languages is so, people absolutely idolize you if you can speak more than just English. and they really encourage you to speak more languages. So a couple of times a week, I take Hiramba to the children's centre that's in one of the neighbouring villages to play with some of the other babies there. And they're really encouraging me to continue speaking to him in Hindi. They ask how he's getting on. And when I listen to the other mums in the group with their children, they're speaking to their children in their native languages. So there are some Spanish ladies, they're speaking in Spanish to their children. So the language, your mother tongue, the West really appreciates that it's in the child's best interest to learn the language of their parents, whatever language they are most comfortable in, most skilled in. And that, for example, in my case, that learning two languages, so learning English and Hindi, that will only do him even better in life than me just speaking to him in English. They keep saying, even if he was learning 3 or 4 or 5 languages, that's all for the better. So there's no sense in limiting people to numbers of languages. And why it's really important for people to be learning their mother tongue from their parents is that ultimately the language that you learn will give you certain life opportunities. And if you are able to speak very fluently in your own native mother tongue, that will set you up better in life. And I'll give you an example of that. And I believe this may actually have been resulting from a tweet I saw by Sankrant ji a few years ago, I think it was, where he was commenting on interviewing somebody in his company. And that individual was really struggling to describe to answer a question that he asked me. It was a very technical question, I remember, something to do with computer programming, and the interviewee was really struggling to answer it. And he said, "I'm so sorry. Could we repeat this? But can I do it in my language?" Which I can't remember if it was Telugu or whichever, a regional language. And of course, he said yes, and then that interviewee excelled, just answered the question like it just in a transformed way, really shone, answered it so well. And it just goes to show that forcing English upon themselves is actually limiting Hindus in many ways, because it's not the language of your ancestors, of your parents. It's imposed on you in a way that makes you to divorce yourself from how you intuitively are seeing the world as a Hindu. Now, I've mentioned this study many times in the past, a study conducted in the US by some linguists, looking at the impact on people's socio-political views of speaking English versus speaking their mother tongue. And in this case, it actually was a study conducted in India, in Uttar Pradesh. So they compared 2 groups of people who speak English only in very formal occasions, so in international business meetings and that sort of thing, or in their English school lessons where they're learning English as a second language, as a foreign language, compared to people who speak English all the time. And they found that actually socio-political views mapped onto those 2 groups really quite neatly. And that wasn't because the people who were speaking English all the time, they were having access only to English medium newspapers and media. No, they accounted for that in the statistical model. So you were literally comparing the 2 groups on how the language has rewired their brain to see the world differently. Isn't that amazing? So there we have such clear proof that of the damage that the English language is doing to Hindus particularly, but to the chances of India. Because when you look at other countries that have been devastated, yes, India has been devastated. It's been the victim of 1,000 years of genocide. Other countries have had tumultuous past as well. The countries that fared badly out of the Second World War, Germany, Japan. Look how they rebuilt themselves in their own languages afterwards. They're doing really well, these countries, and they did it in their own language. And India, obviously, it hasn't done as well, not nearly as well. And I feel the English language is massively, massively to blame for that. So I can see lots of people have joined. Thank you very much for doing so. If you wouldn't mind, please do ask any questions that you feel would be that I can answer. Anything that you have an interest to ask me, please go ahead. Unfortunately, the guest I had planned for today, he wasn't able to join. So I'm doing this session sort of at lib. I'm just looking through, are there any questions at the moment? Just reading a few of them out. So Harsh Gupta ji, Namaste. Germans and British used our ancient texts, which resulted in large number of inventions, yet during the last 300 to 400 years. But in India, when we say such things, we are called communal sangis. Absolutely. Can you clarify when Ramayana happened? Okay. So I'm not, of course, the authority on this at all. So let's continue the question from Harshaji. According to our texts, it happened in Treta Yuga, 18 million years ago, which is against the notion of Darwinism. But so yes, I'm not the authority on this, but it's actually a question that I have a big interest in, and that my husband and I, we've been discussing many times, we've been reading about, we've been pondering, we've been asking people. So I can't answer this question, but I can maybe just give you some insight onto some of the ideas or some of the things that we've learned in trying to understand this question for ourselves. And that is that the multiplier is, so in the text, there's a word that basically implies that you need to multiply the numbers by a very large number. And that's then when you get to this 18 million years ago. So there is debate on if that word actually means that large number that you multiply with. So that's one aspect that I understand, that when you actually look at multiple texts, some of them include that word when they're describing these timelines of the Ramayana, for example, and some of them don't, they omit it, they don't mention it. So it's almost as if that word, that multiplier, maybe extraneous, maybe wasn't required, or is there for poetic purposes. It's trying to convey something that we have not understood in our sort of very literal translation of these texts. That's one aspect. The other aspect is, I have understood from, actually, I think it was somebody on Twitter, that the yogas, they may not be universal in their application. It may be that different geographical regions on Earth, across the whole universe, have their own sort of micro versions of the yugas. So what may have been Treta Yuga in Bharat at that time may not have been Treta Yuga somewhere else on Earth. It may be localized. And I'm saying may because, as I said, I'm not the authority on this, but I think that's a really interesting point, because that then could explain why, even when you remove that multipliers word, and it then recalibrates things, so that I believe Ramayana may then have happened, I think it's about 8 to 11,000 years ago, which from a Darwinian point of view maybe makes more sense. Then how could it, if you trace the progression of the yogas since then, we would end up that the last 1,000 years in India would have, it wouldn't make sense in terms of the colonial timelines mapped against the yogas. It would be saying that the West and India were when you map it against what actually has happened in relatively recent history, when you look at the yogas, it wouldn't make sense to say, this was a really good time or that was a really bad time for those countries, unless it is localized. So the yogas are progressing, evolving at different, out of sync with each other in different parts of the world, essentially. So that's my best answer I can give on that question. If anyone has better insights, please do write it down. It'd be really fascinating to understand. And another question, another statement, Dharma Yoga Ashram, Ji, Namaste. Anti-Hinduism is rampant. Look at today's phony yoga stuff. Yes, I mean, even the word yoga, we have such an excellent example of misuse of this word, not only in the West, but by Indians themselves. Yoga means union with Bhagwan. Yoga asanas are the positions, the preparation to help you on your journey towards that union with Bhagwan. And the fact that Hindus are divorcing themselves from yoga asanas, but also, and by implication, yoga, by saying, no, all religions are the same. Yoga is not Hindu. You hear this all the time. It's universal. Yes, it is for everyone in terms of everyone could benefit from it, but it doesn't mean it's not Hindu. It is Hindu. So many of the gurus, I'm reading back on this question now, many of the gurus are denying they are Hindu and making these non-Hindu-y. Yes, absolutely. It really irritates me where I come across, Twitter accounts for people who, this is when I'm looking on topics other than Hindu Dharma and India, where I see people self-proclaim themselves as a yogi. And I'm just thinking, oh my goodness, you have no idea what you're saying. It's so insulting. But of course, they're completely clueless because there isn't that net around different Hindu practices to make people realize that this is actually a very sacred word, a very sacred idea, a very sacred notion. And so it's up to be exploited. And the reason why they don't realize this is because Hindus themselves are saying, it's not religious, it's not Hindu, it's just for everyone. I mean, can you imagine for, in the Abrahamic religions, if the things that were really central to those religions, really sacred, if they were saying, this is not Christian or this is not Muslim, and actually almost encouraging other people of other religions to be exploiting them, insulting these words, like it's just completely unimaginable. And yet it happens, and Hindus do nothing to stop it because they are saying such silly things. And perhaps part of it can be blamed on the fact that they are speaking in English and they're not understanding necessarily maybe what they're saying. But I think that's a poor excuse. I think it's more than that. They've almost gone into this group think of thinking they understand what is best for Hinduism, that is to appeal to the rest of the world, without realizing that actually what would appeal to the rest of the world is just being Hindu in a Hindu sense. Because what really attracted me to Hinduism was Hindu Dharma. It was the Hindu Shastras. It was the idea that Hindus protect Dharma, what is right, and that is on a very empowered level. You are empowered to know what is right, what is wrong. And it's not based on dogma. That in itself is so appealing. There's no need to be bending backwards to seem even, to be appealing in other ways, such as by saying yoga is not Hindu. It's this completely delusional thinking that somehow has caught on and is causing really terrible damage to Hindus. We have here, hello, our daughter, lots of love from Canada. Namaste, Joanne G. what else we have here? Sanskrit, the mother of most European languages, absolutely. We Indians learn English. Their mind works according to Greenwich Mean Time. Yeah. So yes, that's actually a very good point again here from Harshaji, that even when Indians, they feel that they're trying to appeal to the West, that I think it's that they feel that the West appreciates them, that it's almost like they are looking for validation. And the thing is that, in the West, we're not going to give you validation. Not me personally, but the general population in the West, they really don't care about people outside the European Union, certainly, like outside Europe, and mostly in the UK, they mostly just care about people English people in the UK. They never think about people elsewhere in the world. We really don't. I remember growing up and not really having a clue about anything in Asia. You never think about these other countries. You only think about the Western world. So Indians can appeal to the West as much as possible, but it's not going to make the West appreciate India anymore. Sucking up in that way. It's never a good look, is it, to suck up, to try and fawn over. Actually, what people respect is strength, conviction. And again, that's why I was so attracted to Hindu Dharma, was the conviction of people who were strongly Hindu, who were strongly protective of Dharma throughout history. All of the heroes, heroines of Hindu Dharma, it's that conviction, that strength that really inspired me. It's not hearing people saying, oh, all religions are the same, that sort of thing. That sort of wishy-washy idea. Another question here. So, I can show these actually, can't I? Here. Why? So, Dharma Yoga Ashramji again, thank you. Why not confront all the Indian leaders that deny the words Hindu? It's a very good question. Unfortunately, I personally have tried to take this on a few times, but my reach isn't nearly strong enough. We need many, many, many more people saying these things. And I do sense, over the years that I've been present on social media, that there is a move to be putting pressure on the Indian leaders. But I don't sense they're hearing, unfortunately. I'm not really sure what would persuade them otherwise. I'd be, if anyone has any ideas, please do write them so we can discuss that in this session. Namaste, I can see some more people have joined. Please do be writing some questions in. Unfortunately, my guest today wasn't able to join. Let me see, so any more questions? Okay, again, Harshaji, and thank you very much. Bhagwan Rama ruled for 11,000 years ago. Yep. That agreed with what I was saying earlier about removing that multiplier word. People think that's impossible and say it's all mythology and fiction. And unfortunately, again, here's where the use of the English language creates problems, because Hindus themselves nearly always are saying it is mythology, because even when they mean it is real, because they don't understand that mythology means made up. It happens all the time. When I'm looking for YouTube videos for Hiramba to watch, and little cartoons about Ramayana, for example, the channels would be called mythology this or whatever, so it's just rampant, this idea. And even when it's like a channel in Hindi, in the title, they'll still use the English word mythology. The mind just boggles why this is, but part of it is to blame. I think that they're not understanding what they mean in English. Any more questions? Please do keep adding questions for me. Any ideas on how to counter the massive phony yoga movement? It's a very good question. So I think really We need to be looking at absolute basics here, because as I mentioned earlier, the word yog, union with God, is what it, union with Bhagwan is what it means. So we need to be, helping Hindus the very basic of understanding that, of understanding how yoga asanas are preparation on that bigger journey, and to be understanding how the other religions, how that is completely incompatible with the other religions, where there is a God looking down upon you, casting judgment, whereas here yoga is about union. You're unifying with Bhagwan rather than being judged by a very separate entity. And then it makes it very clear in your mind that yoga asanas are Hindu. And we then need to be getting that message, or that understanding about the damage of what misusing these words is having. Get these messages to the leaders, the Hindu leaders. How that is done, I really struggle to understand. I mean, I had great hopes that there would be political direction on this, but that has not materialized at all. In fact, the opposite has happened, very sadly. So yes, I'm afraid I can't really provide a solution on this. We have to just hope that enough political pressure, enough of a groundswell from the Hindu population at large builds up and demands this of the Hindu leaders, of the political leaders, that they understand exactly the damage that they are doing and how this is so dangerous for Hindus. They obviously, I feel they must feel that what they're doing is the right thing, but they really need to have that idea shattered, because it's going in the complete opposite direction. Any more questions? Appeasement, yes, appeasement, yes. That's why they're doing it. Very good point here. Imagine telling Christians that, baptism is underwater therapy. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's a really good example. Really good example. Any more questions, please do. It's history, aka itihas. Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much for that. Something that it's not mythology, it's history. Very good question here. Why do most of Hindus not teach about Dharma to their children? Yeah. So obviously, again, I feel the parents themselves are thinking it's in their children's interests to be focusing on other things. I don't think they actually go out of their way, many of them, to not be teaching it. Just from my interaction, I mean, obviously there will be some, yes, who are deliberately not teaching it because they don't feel it's valid. They don't believe in it themselves. They believe all the lies about Hindu Dharma. But there are those who almost have like an apathetic view to it. And then they view that it's almost in competition with their child's opportunities for success in life, of doing well in school. So again, in previous videos, I've mentioned how apparently Hindu parents are the group of parents, apart from Buddhists apparently, who spend most time with their children. Muslims, it's the lowest, particularly fathers. They spend very little time with their children. It was just, I think, like a couple of hours a week of spending quality time with their children. Hindus, particularly Hindu fathers, spend a lot of time nurturing their children. So the opportunity is there to impart dharmic knowledge, dharmic understanding, but it doesn't happen. And yet, of course, children, the Hindu children, certainly in the West, in the UK, Hindu children really excel in school, really excel. They are, I believe, in primary school education, they are the group that does the best. They have the best scores at the end of when they graduate from primary school. And then when they go into secondary school, I think it was the second highest. I can't remember to which group. But, much better than Western kids that they do in their school exams at the end. So it seems very plausible, doesn't it, that all that quality time that parents are spending with their children, they're focusing on helping them with their homework, with their academic studies, which is very good, of course. But couldn't there be a bit more time for imparting about Hindu Dharma? That's going to set them in even better stead for life than A's and A stars in your exams. Because ultimately what Hindu Dharma teaches you is things like resilience, understanding who you are, understanding your place in the world, understanding the universe, understanding the purpose of life. So there you are helping to mitigate against mental illnesses. You're helping to mitigate against unhealthy lifestyle practices, and that can lead on to disease. So there are so many benefits to imparting Hindu Dharma on a very practical level, of course, as well as the spiritual, the progression towards moksha, that purpose of life. You are helping them in that way, but on a very practical level, you are really setting them up well by raising them to be strongly Hindu. Here we have from Harshaji again. Most don't teach because they themselves don't understand the real meaning of Dharma. Yes, actually, I think that's very true as well. I've noticed there maybe was like a breakdown in that transmission. I think it's been gradual over the generations, but my sense is it was particularly the generation between sort of like my great grandparents and my grandparents, that generation gap is where things started really breaking down, and then it's only got exacerbated because once it's not transmitted at that point, there's nothing then to transmit further, is there? But it'd be interesting if anyone actually has a different view on that. But that's my sense of it. Are there any other good, let me see, other questions coming through? Yes, Indian parents mostly care about job and exams, which, of course, is important, but it shouldn't be the be all and end all. Well, there's a very, very sweet message here. Mum, your videos have changed my perspective towards my religion. Oh, you're too kind, Aryanji. Thank you very much indeed. Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna, absolutely. Who else have we got here? Yes. Oh, this is a really interesting point. There's an attempt to push the Christianity by promoting Jesus's personal character, putting aside the Christian religious books. So, was he perfect? How do we counter this? So the thing is, and one of the things that really I struggle to understand, or I see very differently, is that in the West, we don't, or certainly among the people I know that I grew up with, we don't separate Jesus from the Bible, from the church, from Christianity. And yet I notice in India this happens, where you'll see people say, well, Jesus was, a really good man, did wonderful things, and the Bible just has misconstrued that, and the church then misconstrued that even more when they're trying to explain why are there some, not very nice verses within the Bible, and then you hear about some of the things that the church is doing and have been involved in. They're trying to separate one from the other. And so that doesn't really exist here in the UK. This was a completely new phenomenon to me, to hear from Indians saying, well, the Bible is not Jesus, and Jesus is not the church, and the church is not Christianity. And very new to me. Because actually the only account of Jesus is the Bible. When you look through the records of the Romans, who obviously were ruling at the time, a good area of the world at the time, including the area that Jesus would have been living in nearby, there is no record of Jesus, of a troublemaker, such as, because ultimately, the Romans, they thought of him as the Bible portrays that they thought of him as a sort of a troublemaker. He was stirring things up and trying to convert people away from the thinking of and the religions of the mainstream society at that time. There's no account of that, and yet the Romans were meticulous record keepers. So there's no record of him existing other than what the Bible says. So how can we judge what his personal character was other than what was written in the Bible? And there are verses in the Bible that describe, as I said, very violent practices, very, what we would, I think, all consider very immoral things. So things like, if a slave is somebody who does morti worship, essentially, who worships idols, that you can then, as their owner, as their master, their owner, you can whip them to the point where they are pretty much until they're basically dead, except you can't actually kill them, but you can just about almost kill them. So that's what the Bible writes. Or, for another example being that if a woman is screaming out for when she's being raped, if nobody can hear her, then that's a good enough reason to assume that she wanted to be raped and therefore should be killed. So there are these very ugly verses in the Bible, and there are verses within the Bible as well that say, Jesus agrees with all of this. And so we have to take that at face value. We've got no other information about him. So we can't say that his personal character was very good, can we? So I don't know why you see this quite often, that some Hindu leaders, I say Hindu in inverted commas, leaders within India who have a Hindu affiliation but maybe do not necessarily identify with Hindu actually, that they try and shine a very positive light on Jesus. And I really wish they wouldn't. If you don't want to, criticize, that's fine. Okay. But you don't need to praise either. There's no need for it. In the other religions, they don't go around praising each other's deities, and they will be criticizing. So if you don't want to stoop to their level, fine. There's no need to praise. So yes, that's my answer to that really, really good question. Thank you very much. Okay, let me see some more questions here. Here in South India, again, Namaste Aryanji, South India, rural areas are converted to Christianity by luring poor people is a massive problem. Yeah, See, this is where there's this dual approach, or this dual-pronged approach that needs to be taken. Firstly, to be decentivizing conversion to Christianity, because at the moment there are benefits to not being Hindu. We think on a very practical level, what do Hindus get in India? I've read people say actually it's the most anti-Hindu country in the world, and yet it is the only place that could conceivably really be a Hindu country anytime soon. And yet it's the most anti-Hindu country in the world. You don't get any benefits from being a Hindu. You get benefits from being a minority, coming from a minority religion. So that's something that absolutely needs to be stopped. Things like freeing the Hindu temples, all these things we know, changing the education system so that the minority schools are not free to teach what they want, and yet the Hindus, the standard schools are very constrained to a colonizer's syllabus, essentially. So that's one thing that needs to change. Another is to be strengthening the resolve of Hindus in their Hindu Dharma, and that means changing the minds of some of these Hindu leaders, or the leaders that people look up to as Hindus, as sources of Hindu Dharma, when they're not. We've already discussed this so many times already. This video is a real challenge. We need to be bringing them on board to understanding the damage that they are doing. And then, of course, you need to be physically stopping the people who are doing the conversion work down on the ground from being able to operate. So that's all those NGOs, particularly the funding coming from overseas. But I see more and more that actually now we're at the point where it's Christian Indians themselves converting fellow Indians into Christianity, rather than necessarily so much from outside of India. And yeah, so a multi-pronged approach needs to be taken, and for that we need strong leadership. I mean, in fact, all of these issues, we just need strong Hindu leadership, and then things can happen. There's no barrier to all this change happening other than, unfortunately, Hindus themselves, and by that I mean the leadership. Lots of questions coming in. Thank you very much, everyone. Another really good question here. Do you think, Namaste Ji, Namaste, do you think that dharmic cultures need to be spread in the West and Eastern world by educating people about it and spreading awareness about it? Absolutely. I mean, to begin with, let's start on sort of solidifying Hindu Dharma in the countries it is already in. That's really so important. But at the same time, that doesn't mean we shouldn't then be spreading it outside of India at the same time. And I've said this before, that I actually feel that, I know some people, they might feel differently about this, but I feel that ISKCON actually does a really good job. And yes, there is some criticism, I understand. But from what I've seen, what I've experienced of ISKCON, most of them are strongly Hindu people. There's no doubt about it at all. In fact, one of my favorite YouTube channels is I Love Mayapur. Do check it out. It's a wonderful family living in Mayapur, and following their lives. And if they're not Hindu, who is? Absolutely wonderful. So they are an ISKCON family. I've been involved with. I have met other ISKCON devotees, and they are truly inspirational Hindus, very strong devotees. So that's a really good vehicle, and they're really good at getting things done, I feel, for spreading. But yes, there can be obviously other ways of spreading it as well. As I said earlier, what I feel the Hindu leaders think is the best way to spread is by trying to appease, by trying to appeal to Westerners, by speaking in sort of Westerner language, in terms of almost like Christian language, and be talking about ideas in a Christian way. But actually, that's the most off-putting thing. It really is. If you're trying to look for an alternative to Christianity, you don't want to be hearing about Jesus anymore. You don't want to be hearing about the Christian understanding or Christian perspective on forgiveness. You want to hear about Hindu Dharma. How does Hindu Dharma view certain things? You want to be hearing about the Hindu Shastras, something different. So yes, that's my take on how we should be spreading, is by staying true to Hindu Dharma and not being apologetic about it in any way, because people value strength and conviction, as I said. Okay, so here we have Munish Ji, Namaste. Okay, so have I read it? No. I am still very novice, I must say, in my reading of various shastras, of various scriptures, of various accounts. But I will thank you for that recommendation. I would absolutely do so. Got some very beautiful appreciation messages. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you very much, Animesh Ji. Here we have from Aditya Ji, Namaste. Um, so yes, we've talked about this point. Is it so? The question is is this tragedy? Is this hypocrisy? Is it stupidity? Is it appeasement? Is it malice? Is it something else? I can't answer exactly what it is. It's probably a combination of it all, and ultimately, I think it's groupthink. People have, for some reason, think that Westerners like to hear certain things without realizing that actually that probably isn't the best strategy. We don't want to be hearing about Jesus anymore. We don't want to be looking at parallels between Hindu Dharma and Christianity. We don't want to be thinking that certain Hindu things are not Hindu; they're universal and waffly. So it's almost actually, I guess, it's like an arrogance of assuming you understand what the Westerner thinks, rather than just going out and probably asking them. And I guess maybe he feels he has asked some Westerners what would work, perhaps, and other Hindu leaders have as well. But maybe they haven't asked the right people. I'm not saying that necessarily I'm the right people, but I'm probably a bit more representative. My thinking, my thought processes about Hindu Dharma is probably a bit more representative than many of the people who naturally are inclined towards Hindu Dharma. Because I grew up very much not from a very strongly religious background, religious family. I was not a religious person. I wasn't really going out searching for answers. They kind of came to me in the form, through my husband and my experiences of just being part of Hindu festivals and learning about the Shastras and being inspired in that way. So I remember very much the prejudices I had towards Hindus and the ignorance I had and everything before I met my husband. So I'm probably a better person to ask because that's more representative of a Western mindset, which is one of just not caring about people elsewhere in the world, not being religious, being very, I was never materialistic myself, but many are very materialistic, very much, attached to this material world, not really having any desire to think beyond the metaphysical, beyond the physical, I mean. So there's that. As I go back to this question, maybe they have asked what would work, what's a good strategy for trying to appeal to Westerners, but they have probably asked people who are naturally very inclined to Hindu, to exploration, to trying to delve within, understand the meaning of life. And why I'm trying to say here in a very tactful way is that's why many of the people that you see following some of these 5-star gurus from the West, many of them, they will be wearing, they will have many piercings. They may have dreadlocks. And of course, there's nothing wrong with any of this, but it does indicate a certain type of person that isn't very prevalent in the West. It's not representative. In fact, I heard one person describe them as almost like they are and I don't think this is true. They're not outcasts. That's the wrong word, but they are a small percentage of the population who see the world in a slightly different way. They probably are naturally Brahmins, I would imagine. And so if you were to ask them what works, what appeals to them, they'll answer something very different than the general population in the West. And ultimately, if you're wanting to create massive change, you need to be appealing to the population at large, not a very small number of people. Okay, thank you very much. Another question here. In what ways is Hinduism very different than the other religions? So I mentioned one example earlier. A massive way is that the Abrahamic religions see you as separate from God, whereas in Hindu Dharma, the idea is actually that you unify, you merge. So that's one massive way, because then if you are always being judged everything you are doing is out of fear, because everything you do in this life will have an impact on what happens to you in this one, after this one single life that you'll go to this, heaven or whatever. Whereas in Hindu Dharma, things are much more nuanced, much more subtle, much more complex, because of this cycle of karma and of rebirth. It's actually much more intellectual, Hindu Dharma is, than the Abrahamic religions. And I think that's one of the other things that really appeals to me and would appeal to many people in the West, is actually how much it makes you think. You're not being told, do this, do that, and this is how it works. You're encouraged to always be thinking about universes and beyond universes and massive time scales, and encouraged to consider what is actually right and what is wrong and what the gray between that might be. So overall, what should be the thing to do? And it's very intellectual. So that's another way in which it's very different. And obviously, yes, the cycle of rebirth versus just one life and then you go to heaven or hell, that's a massive, massive difference. So there are some real basic differences that just completely defy the idea that all religions are the same. They're completely incompatible to be so different and then to be the same. It can't be. So they are very, very different. Okay, lovely question here. So what's my plans for Navratri and Diwali? Well, actually, my in-laws have recently arrived in the UK. So they'll be here with us for Navratri, which will be lovely. We always celebrate Navratri in a really big way. It's my favorite festival. And so each day we will be going into our home mandir. We do the chanting for the Devi, the form of Ma, that day. And I love reading up about, the attributes of that version of that is particularly worshipped on that day, and just reflecting on how Hindu Dharma celebrates all aspects of the feminine. As I said, it's my absolute favorite festival. And then we always go to some of the relatively local gatherings where there'll be a large murti of Ma Durga. We will go there. Unfortunately, where we live, there are no mandirs nearby. Even these gatherings, we have to travel about 1 hour away to attend. But, that's an absolute pleasure to travel for Navratri. I absolutely adore the festival. And then Diwali, yes, good question. So there may be a chance potentially that we will be in Bharat, but actually I think it's unlikely, unfortunately. We may be going back to Bharat in November. We also need to be thinking about Hiramba's Mundan at some point. His hair is getting very long, but actually maybe somebody here might know, and if you do know the answer, please do message about at what ages can you perform Mundan, because he's now 16 months old. I've been told now actually we have to wait until he is more than 2 years old to have his Mundan, in which case his hair will be very, very long. We're tying it up, which is fine. But yes, we may tie our next visit into Bharat so that we can do the Mundan at the same time. But at the moment, yes, we're not sure what exactly we'll do for Diwali. I mean, we probably will be at home, and ultimately, isn't that the best place to be for Diwali, to welcome Ma Lakshmi to your own home? So yes, thank you for that question. Yeah, can't disagree at all. This is a very interesting question. What's my opinion? I think, unfortunately, it's unlikely. But wouldn't it be wonderful? Yes. I don't see it happening by then. I can hear a little person has just entered the room. Oh, there are lots more questions. Look who it is. Con hai? Hiramba hai. Ha? Bolo namaste, Hiramba. Namaste. हाँ लंबे लंबे बाल. हाँ नमस्ते. नमस्ते करो. हाँ बहुत लोग हैं भारत में. हाँ हाँ हाँ. So yes, that was little Hiramba. I think I probably will have to be going off to be with him again very, very soon. Just think that any more burning questions? I'll just answer this one as well. Oh, sorry, he just banged his head on the wall. He's okay. This question as well. So how did Christianity manage to get the religion of love tag? Something I've really noticed is that Christianity has been very good in recent centuries at sort of like metamorphosizing into this very nice looking religion. And I guess it was to shake off some of the baggage that it comes with. Obviously burning of witches, burning of scientists, forcing people to convert under the sword. This is colonization, obviously. So this is the baggage that Christianity comes with. And it's done, as I say, it's done really well to shake all that off and to kind of like rebrand itself, I guess. And there have been ways in which it has done that, very concrete ways, such as running oh, I can see that Sankrant has just appeared. Amazing. Namaste ji.
Namaste, namaste. I'm sorry about the
Of
time
course.
confusion. I'm a little bit in a time warp right now. I'm recovering from an illness, and I thought it was 9:30, not 8:30. So here I
Oh,
am.
oh, are you feeling okay now?
Yeah, yeah. I'm much better. Yes.
Oh, thank goodness. Well, no worries at all. Thank you so much for joining. Yes, well, what a surprise. Fantastic. So perhaps yeah, we'll carry on, I guess, in that case. If you wouldn't mind, Sankrantji, just giving a brief description. It's okay. So just one second. Mind giving a brief just description of yourself, of your biography? Tell us a bit about Garuda Prakashan, please.
Yes, sure. I've one part of my biography is I've spent about half my life in the United States and about half my life in India. I went there as a graduate student. I've lived in the US for about 30 years, but I'm actually on my way back in a way. So uh, I came back to India earlier this summer. I've been spending a lot of time here, anyways. So my journey has been really very much a cross-cultural journey in studying, in studying the West as well as in studying our own traditions. And I went through a typical career, went to IIT, went to did my graduate studies in computer science, work at Microsoft, did all the multinational, international things. And then I actually quit very early. I retired when I was 35, and I decided to spend my life really seeking dharma and seeking my own quest and discovering what are the what are the things that really move me. So I became a teacher for the art of living. I teach meditation and yoga. I became an author and kind of just wrote my own path about how I wanted to go about life. So that's what brings us here. And then about 5 years ago, I started a book publishing company to highlight aspects of Indian culture and bring that to a wider audience. And that's called Garuda Prakashan. Website is garudabooks.com.
Fantastic. And we're really grateful that you did. There are some really fantastic books that have been published through Garuda Prakashan. So perhaps you might tell the viewers about some of these books. What are some key examples?
Absolutely. In fact, we're very proud with this new book, which is just coming out called The Imperishable Seed, how Hindu mathematics changed the world. So this is done by a PhD from IIT Kanpur, Bhaskar Kamble, and he has put together a fantastic study going back into the original Sanskrit texts about much of the mathematics that we read today in schools, including all of the basic arithmetic operations and trigonometry, algebra, the basis of calculus, how a lot of this actually came from India, how it was transmitted, why that knowledge was erased and lost. I mean, a lot of times when we think about mathematics from India, we really think about zero, and we don't really even understand the significance of it. What does it mean? That India invented zero, but it's not really about zero. It's the entire place value decimal notation, because without zero you can't have 5647 represent 5647 in the way that it does, because that's the place value notation. So imagine trying to multiply that in Greek, in Roman numerals. If you wrote 5645 in Roman numerals and you were told to multiply that by itself, you wouldn't go very far, in multiplying it. And in fact, that's why European mathematics actually couldn't go very far till the decimal system was created. But it wasn't just the decimal system, it was the algorithm for then how you could manipulate these numbers for arithmetic operations, which is where the basis of the notion of algorithm comes. And then the notion of algebra is very much linked to place value notation, because every number is actually an algebraic expansion of the 10 series. So it's 10 to the power 3 times 5 plus 10 to the power 2 times 6 plus 10 to the power 1 times 4, and so on and so forth. So the arithmetic, the decimal notation itself is actually simply an algebraic expansion. So a lot of the great work in that. And then trigonometry, we've traced how what is the root of this word sine and cos and so forth. How did it come from India? How was it mangled in translation and all of that? So really, really fantastic book called The Imperishable Seed. um, and among other books we've published, there's the book called Unbreaking India, which is tracing a whole lot of the activities that led up to the partition of India, and then how the article, around Jammu and Kashmir, taking that back, Article 370, why that was so significant historically. So there's books like that. There's the book called Lotus in the Stone, which is a very personal journey of an Indian woman just experiencing somebody who brought up in a very modern milieu, and experiencing pilgrimage and experiencing um, India through this very different lens, on her own journey and pilgrimage, by Anuradha Goyal. She's an author of Indie Tales. General G.D. Bakshi. Of course, one of our very famous books was the book Urban Nexus by Vivek Agnihotri, who also did the Kashmir Files. He's one of our authors. Um, so really, we've been very, very, very fortunate, very blessed to be able to be change makers in many ways and create new discourses, new dialogues.
Fantastic. See, I believe I first learned about Garuda Prakashan through Saffron Swords,
Yes,
Minoshiji.
yes, yes, yes.
My husband, he sponsored for a large number of the books to be distributed amongst children, I remember, in one area. And then
Yeah,
other
that's
books
such a
later.
fantastic book as well. Saffron
Yeah,
Swords is such a fantastic book, because all the time growing up in India, we are told that we always keep learning about all these invaders came and we lost and we lost and we lost, but we never learned about all those times that we won, and the fact that they couldn't really establish the hold that they wanted to, because there was always resistance, there was always somebody fighting back. And that's why our tradition survived, not because we were just passive and let everybody run over us, but because we constantly resisted the invasions.
absolutely. And in fact, I was just reading one of the comments here. You know, only Hinduism survived 800 years of Islamic invasion, 200 years of Christian colonization, 50 years of communist infiltration. The ancient Egyptians, Rome, Chinese, they got killed or converted. I mean, there are many others as well. The Aztecs, the Mayans, the Native American Indians, the natives in Canada, you know, they were completely decimated but Hindus survived, and that really is testament to, I think, partially the strength of their faith.
Well, I think it's because there's two reasons I would ascribe to it. One is that the Hindu traditions were always very decentralized. So, a lot of times, if you, for instance, conquered the Aztec king, or if you took out the sort of the central figure, then you could end up actually changing or converting a lot of the population. But this was not true of the Hindu traditions. Like, you could come and you could even slaughter a king or even conquer a king, convert a king. That wouldn't mean that all the subjects are going to just follow, because the traditions were very decentralized, very ingrained into people's lives. And it has been and still is a very living tradition. So it's very difficult to wipe it out. You really have to go to every village and stamp it out,
Yep,
which really nobody had the wherewithal to do. And secondly, as I already mentioned, there was a lot of resistance. There was a lot of resistance that was taking place all throughout the time of through all of the invasions, whether it was the British invasion or the Islamic conquest. There was constant resistance that was happening. So it wasn't like it was a cakewalk at any time.
of course. But this now will bring us on to the main topic of our discussion, which is that Hindus survived all of this slaughter, essentially, 1,000 years of physical genocide, and yet perhaps has it ever been as dangerous a time to be a Hindu and as unlikely for Hinduism to survive as it is today? And could potentially language be a reason for that sort of potential for further demise? So I'd be really interested to hear your take on that, Sankrantji, the role of the English language, particularly in that demise of Hinduism.
Well, I think it's really two pronged. It's language and education, and they're very closely tied together. What has happened over the last 100 years or so is that there has been an education system that has really been imposed upon us, that is not rooted in the soil, that was a colonizer's education system. And the colonizer's aim in that education system was to create a class of Englishmen that would be Indian only by name, but in taste and manner and all, in custom, they would actually be emulating or looking up to the English. And so what's happened is that because and language is a very big factor in that, as you mentioned. I have written a book on this called The English Medium Myth. And I went to an English medium school in India growing up. And I also, one of the indoctrinations of English education is not just a language, but it's an indoctrination that teaches us that English is the way to progress. English is the way that we can become, quote, developed or advanced, which is, if it's only after I had experienced the world, I traveled to over 50 countries to study language. It's only after that I realized that this was a story that was told to us. I don't know if you're still on or we are
Yes,
frozen.
absolutely. Yeah. I
Yeah.
believe you may have frozen, or have I frozen? But I can hear you
Yes,
loud
yes.
and
We,
clear.
we both look frozen on the screen. I'm going to quickly grab a charger
Okay, not to
for
worry.
my for my laptop.
So
This is, by
ask
the way,
another
not
question while you do
I
so.
have
Okay.
a regular video setup. I'm actually in a different place as well, so I do apologize where
Oh,
it's
no
not
worries at
quite
all.
professional.
Of
No, just
course.
one moment.
Um, we have here actually a relevant question that maybe once you return, we can discuss, which is, are Hindus in identity crisis by not speaking their own language, not knowing their own culture, and they are mentally colonized? And I would argue that actually perhaps, language is the cause of that identity crisis. Um,
Yes, yes, very much so. I think language has, what language has done, as I said, is firstly, there is an assumption where we are assuming, for instance, that advancement comes from the West, which is also identified with English, and that all science and mathematics and all of this comes from an advanced civilization, and we have to copy them to go forward. I mean, it's completely absurd given that I just ended up speaking on this book called The Imperishable Seed, which shows that really most of modern mathematics, which is the root of most of modern science, directly came from India. It came from Sanskrit texts. It came from, it was developed in Indian languages. So the idea that you have to discard these languages to advance in any way in science and technology is absurd, both empirically. If you look all over the world, countries, including Japan and now what China is doing, all of those countries have developed, all of European countries, France, Germany, everywhere else, have developed both economically and technically using their own languages. But in India, we are suffering from this notion that um, we have to discard our languages to make progress, or discard our languages for us to develop. So I think that's one notion that really confuses a lot of us, and also makes us look at our own civilization as inferior, and then the colonizer civilization as superior. So those uh, are very key uh, aspects that constantly erode our self confidence in ourselves. And I see this a lot when in talking to children all across the country and going to colleges and giving talks. A lot of children come up to me and speak about how much English has become a barrier for them in India, how much English erodes their self confidence in themselves, the confidence to be able to do high quality work, and to be able to feel that they can be successful in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually, earlier in this session or earlier on, I was saying that I know of some Indians who don't speak any Indian language. They only speak English, living in India. And it's almost as if they are expats living in their own country. And when you are an expat, you are being divorced from from the surrounding people, right? So you're divorcing yourself from your own country, and living a very sort of, I guess, it's like an alien life within your own country. Um, and I've previously had somebody's got in touch with me, to tell me that they know of people in India who only know the tu or tum declension of the Hindi verbs. They don't know the up because they only use it to speak to people who they think are inferior. They have no need to learn the up declension. So that's just really, really sad. And it just, yeah, as you say, it agrees with what you're saying about they look down upon their own language, and then in doing so, they're looking down upon themselves, aren't they?
Absolutely. I think that whole thing is very tied together, looking down upon one's own culture, on one's own tradition and one's own language, and then having this assumption that that is the way to actually move forward in the world. Where if you actually look at the data and the countries, in my book, The English Medium Myth, I have this table which shows that if you look at the top 20 countries in GDP per capita, every single one of them uses the language of the common people for higher education, for instance, and for the government services, for judiciary, and so on and so forth. Whereas if you look at the poorest 20 countries, 18 out of those 20 countries use some colonizer language and think that they're going to get advanced because of that. So the poorest countries are those that are using colonizer languages, and the richest countries are those that are using their own mother tongues for education and for administration. So it's that's why it's a myth. It's something that people have internalized, and that internalization of the inferiority of language transmits over to inferiority of culture, to inferiority of traditions, to inferiority of Hinduism, and so on and so forth.
Absolutely. When in fact we know that the Indian languages, I certainly feel are superior to certainly English, which is a very limited language. Um, and particularly then when you're comparing it to Sanskrit, it's very clearly an inferior language. I liken it, as I mentioned earlier, again in the session, that many people, they'll say to me, "Well, your language is just a tool. It's like a calculator." And I argue, well, no, you can actually, well, yes, maybe it's like a calculator, but you can have different grades of calculator. You can have a children's calculator that just does plus and minus and divide and multiply. Then you can have a supercomputer to do your calculations. In a similar way, there are different sort of grades of language in terms of the complexity of idea, of thought that they can convey, and particularly, obviously, for the ideas and thoughts that they convey that are describing the history of that culture. The English language just cannot possibly convey some Hindu ideas. It just cannot at all. And that obviously leaves a lot of misconstrued ideas.
Yes, I think there's two or three levels of that. One is that one can compare languages by themselves in some objective manner. And if you look at that, Indian languages are very scientific because even their alphabet itself is generated through Panini's rules.
Yeah.
So Panini fully specifies it's actually a computer matrix by which the entire Devanagari alphabet is generated. It's a fascinating thing, and a lot of computer science scientists have also looked into this. But if you look at K, K, G, G, from where how you go from K to K is the aspiration of the K sound, which is coming from the back of the throat. And the entire alphabet is arranged um, based on the sound producing capabilities of parts of your anatomy. So it's completely scientific in the way it is structured, and then the way the sounds come together to form sayable sounds. So you have very, in English has vowels and consonants, but it's not very scientific. It's just kind of random. Whereas here you've laid out the swara and the vyanjan, and you say without the swara it's impossible to express a vyanjan, and the swara gives the so there's a whole science behind how sound is formed, how languages, how words are formed, how even the dhatus, the roots are formed. And so this entire science then creates grammar. And a lot of times, in fact, Europeans rediscovered grammar after they encountered Panini during the colonization phase. So they encountered Panini's grammar, and then they rediscovered their own language grammars as a result of it. So it's much more. So if you look at it that way, yes, it's true. But if I look at it even very simply, which is that across the world, there is ample research that shows that children learn best in their mother tongue. So it doesn't matter if your mother tongue is English. Yes, you will learn best in your mother tongue. If your mother tongue is Russian, you're going to learn best in Russian. And if your mother tongue is Hindi or Tamil or Bengali, you're going to learn best in that mother tongue, because language. In fact, it was an interesting incident. I was giving a talk on this in Delhi, and this nondescript person came up to me and said, "Oh yeah, I'm doing a little bit of research on this." I was like, "Okay, who are you?" And he's like, "Oh, I work for Harvard Medical College in Boston, and I'm doing research on language acquisition and neural pathways that are formed during language acquisition." And he ended up writing a foreword for my book. His name is Dr. Shantanu Ghosh, and what he demonstrated is that even prenatally, you are actually starting to establish language pathways in the baby's brain, and those pathways are very efficient pathways for acquisition of knowledge later on. So you can't just suddenly substitute a mother tongue for some other language and assume it's going to be equally efficient in knowledge acquisition, for instance. So people who say it's just a tool, just they haven't studied it. They're just making things up.
Absolutely. And this exact reason why when I was pregnant, I was playing, many songs in Hindi, playing many recitations of the Shastras in Sanskrit
Yes.
to not only myself, but to my unborn child. That they would be not only experiencing the path of that divine knowledge and the content, but hearing the sounds. I remember reading that if a child has not, by the age, I think if it's of 8 months old, if they have not heard certain sounds from within a language, they will always find it very difficult to hear those sounds. So, for me, there are still sounds within the Varnamala that I find very difficult to discriminate, even though
Sure.
I try and do the Varnamala to my son every day. Still, I really
Right.
struggle. So I think it's by 8 months old. They really need to be hearing this. And again, that's why I tell my husband to keep repeating the Varnamala to my son, so It doesn't have the problems that I.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, there's the, those it becomes difficult if you haven't really heard that right from the beginning, and that way you're so right. There's so much richness in the Indian languages, in the structures of sound, in the vocabulary, and how the vocabulary embodies the knowledge and the teachings. Every word has a history, and it has a meaning, and it has a it has so much. And this is true in English too. I mean, so much of the English language has been formed through the church and formed through Latin, and it embodies Christian vocabulary, and people use it and are like, do you even know what you're saying?
yeah,
Because if you understood the Christian context of it, it has like so much Christian baggage that's
yeah.
attached to a word.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it really sends a shiver down my spine whenever I'm reading things like Hindus saying rest in peace,
Right.
calling their itias,
Exactly.
mythology. And as I was saying earlier to the viewers, that I wonder if sometimes they just don't, it's one of the dangers of using the English language is that maybe they don't understand what they're saying.
Exactly. I mean,
Or
I think somebody had used the word anathema or something on Twitter, and I was like, yeah. I mean, anathema is a direct church word. It comes directly from this history of the church and so on and so forth. I mean, we are using it. Even words like superstition have a lot of baggage attached to it. So it's
even
very difficult.
spiritual.
Yeah.
Yeah. Although I've noticed the church, they kind of they're starting to use the word spiritual. I don't know if it's because I think it's because they realize that they're having to broaden their reach, broaden their appeal to still be appealing to the younger generation. Because certainly in the West, there's
Right.
only very elderly people who go to church now. It's literally
Right.
like 2
Right.
or 3% of the population go to church regularly. So they're trying to find sort of cool ways to be reaching the youth. And like things like the word spiritual, I've mentioned this in another video. It's a really interesting evolution to the UK, how we understand the word spiritual. So somebody like my grandparents' age or great grandparents' age, they would understand the word spiritual to mean like ghosts and Ouija boards, and a bit sort of scary that way. And perhaps even if do you know of Agatha Christie? I imagine the author of Murder on the Orient Express, a very popular author here in the West.
Hmm.
So
Sure.
we would
Sure.
always see the
Sure.
spiritual characters would be the really shady ones who were into like the curses of the Pharaoh's tomb in ancient
Yes.
Egypt. So that in that generation, that's what it means to
Right,
them.
right,
In my
right.
parents' generation, it means sort of like a bit hippie, in this free love, drugs sort of idea. That's what spiritual would mean to some of
The
my
60s
generation.
counterculture thing, Beatles and yeah.
Yeah, and it's from my generation. So we're talking like in the 90s, as a child. Um, it's kind of almost gone a bit back to the previous meaning, but it's more like gothic and witches, like in a cool sense, because there was that kind of fad of people dressing in black
Huh,
and
interesting.
black nail varnish and having
Uh,
crystals and things. That was kind of like a cool phase, and watching sort of funny, scary films, and that's what spiritual meant to people my age. And now it's different again. I feel. I actually think it's it's a better meaning in today. But you have to appreciate though that people from these different age groups, they will always naturally think of it how in the meaning of when they grew up. So yeah, the word spiritual is really fascinating actually, but it's used within Hinduism so much, and people don't realize actually that really presents Hinduism in a
well,
certain
I think
way.
the yeah, it's funny you say that because in America, I think the one of the largest groups you'll find like religion as spiritual but not religious. It's even a drop down category where people are saying we are spiritual but not religious. So that's a very very common way to identify oneself, and it kind of means less like witches and curses and all of that stuff, but more like
Yeah,
new age yoga, that kind of thing is much more where the meaning is headed. And it's actually kind of a funny word. I remember sort of being new ageish from America and coming to India and having a discussion with some more traditional scholars, and I was using the word spiritual, and then they said, "Well, what do you mean? You mean adhyatmic?" And uh, of course, the word in Hindi or Sanskrit would be adhyatma, which, if I look at the root of that, is really about atma, which is the self, and which is about knowing the self. So there is not a dichotomy, and in the West we have this dichotomy of spiritual versus material, but it's not in that same sense that it's used in the Hindu tradition. It's much more, adhyatma is knowledge of the self, and of course, knowing the self, one knows all. So it's not splitting it up into a material versus spiritual, but more about those things that bring us to true knowledge of the self.
Yeah. And the thing that worries me, though, is that often you'll find that Hindus will quite often tick that box of spiritual but not religious, rather than tick Hindu. I don't know if that's
Mm,
something you've noticed as well, but I've really noticed it, and I find it's very worrying.
mm.
To me, it means that they're trying to apologize for being Hindu. Is that how you interpret it as well?
Well, I think there's a range of experience. There's definitely a lot of that going on. I remember I was in Seattle, and there was a very informal meeting with Tulsi Gabbard at that time, before Tulsi had become such a huge star and so well known. I think she was still a congresswoman at that point. So it was like an informal town hall. Maybe there were like 20 people, just having a chat. And I remember I asked her, there was kind of an open question session, and I said, okay, what does it mean for you to be a Hindu in Congress and in American political life? And I noticed that a couple of people on my table, they kind of shrank away and they wanted to quickly change the topic. They felt that it was such an embarrassing thing to say the word Hindu. Whereas Tulsi, of course, was super comfortable with it, and because this was her reality, she had to deal with the reality of being Hindu in a country which still has a lot of conservative Christian values and so on and so forth. So she was answering the question very comfortably, very knowledgeably, and she was talking about how much the Gita has inspired her, and also the prejudice she faces, and many many things. But many, quote, Hindus from India who had been secularized or made to feel shameful or whatever. I don't want to psychoanalyze them, but I could clearly see them visibly shrinking away from even that label, and wanting to quickly change the subject. No, 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 we are not like that, we are secular. But like, why is it that just saying yes, I'm Hindu, have them go through this contortion? And I think it's because there has been a history of kind of shaming that has gone on, for several decades. So one has to be really comfortable in one's skin to say, yeah, this is who I am. And if you're not, then you'll find always kind of ways to apologize and label away from it.
Yeah. And I've said this previously many times, that I actually find this the most unappealing part of being a Hindu, is that many neighboring Hindus are scared to, or embarrassed to say that they don't have the conviction to stand proudly. And I
Absolutely.
find it really frustrating when then some sort of Hindu leaders assume that by saying things like all religions are the same and this kind of waffly stuff, that will
Right.
appeal to Westerners if they're trying to
Right.
reach to convert Westerners into Hinduism. I'm saying, this is
Right.
the most unappealing thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Is strength and conviction, and the Hindu
Absolutely.
Dharma in its very traditional form is appealing enough. You don't need to be changing it to.
Absolutely. You don't need to water it down. You don't need to, like make it into some generic goop or something,
Yeah,
like.
exactly.
And that happens so much, I see, in the West as well, because I end up, I teach, as I said, the Art of Living course, and of course I end up interacting just in the way I am with a very wide cross section. I teach in prison also, for instance, in the Washington state. And it's very interesting that a lot of times people would be very curious, and they'd be wanting to learn about the Hindu tradition, or they'd want to go deeper into yoga, and I'd be talking to them about it. And a lot of them are wanting to escape from this very rigid Christian thing that they were brought up in, and there's conflict in their family, and they really are looking for a way out of there. And then when people say to them, and they say, no, 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 you can just stay Christian, it's all okay, there's like, no, it's not okay. That's what we want to get out of here.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
there's a lot of trauma that people are carrying, and and people don't realize that it's not just so simple to say, no, 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 stay the way you are, as some gurus might end up saying.
Yeah. So you've said it exactly how I feel, and things something I've said so many times as well. That if you're wanting to move away from Christianity, you don't want to
Right.
hear more about Jesus. You don't want to
Yes,
hear about the
exactly.
parallels between Hindu Dharma and Christianity, which many of the sort of five-star gurus they talk about
Right.
these things, and
Right.
it's really unappealing. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And also, I think people, the other thing is that, I mean, in a way, you can't. Everybody's coming from their own context, so in a way, you can't blame the Hindu gurus, because from their vision of the world, they don't see the world split up like that,
Yeah.
right? Well, so they say, well, like if there is something, if there is some icon that really appeals to you and helps you rise, that's good. But what they don't realize is that the trauma
Yeah.
of a civilization that people are carrying, relating to those icons. So it's not a value neutral situation. And
Absolutely. You're taking the
yeah,
words out of my mouth, Sankrantji.
sure,
Absolutely. I've
absolutely.
even gone a bit further than that to say that maybe they should, though, when they are in such positions of power, they should be going a bit further to understand. It's almost
Absolutely.
a bit of an arrogance, though, not to assuming that you know what the other person is thinking. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, I think it is very important, and it's something that I have certainly spoken with. I was in a relationship with a Mormon person for a long period of time, maybe 4 or 5 years. So we had a lot of intense conversation. She actually ended up leaving the Mormon. I mean, she was kind of on the way out, anyways. One of the most interesting dialogues I remember having with her was she was a birth doula, and she said that one of her big realizations was that at every birth she felt kind of this divine presence, and it didn't matter if that person giving birth was Mormon, and she said maybe God wasn't Mormon. and so this was like this big bell striking to her that maybe God wasn't Mormon. And I was just laughing and laughing, because such an absurd idea from a Hindu perspective, that God would be Mormon or Christian or Hindu or any of those things, right? we
Yeah.
don't we don't look at the world like that.
Yeah.
So I think it's important, for, especially I think for Hindus in the West and for Hindu gurus, to really understand the cultural context of the people that they're interacting with. And a lot of them, do, they naturally assume it's just people like us, which of course at some level is true, but the indoctrination is nothing like us. And we have to realize it's nothing like us, and we have to really be open to listening, at the same time be open to to saying, this is wrong, or this is the way it is. We are so afraid to say, no, no, this, like, I actually ended up, if you notice on Twitter, this was actually an explicit decision at one point, since I was kind of a very, quote, secularized Hindu at one point as well. But I made an explicit decision to be critical of the two big proselytizing religions, because I felt it's important for somebody from an Hindu perspective to actually say things the way that I'm seeing them, because I see that there are people stuck there. There are people that are stuck there that are actually looking for a way out. They're looking for light, and to just abandon them and say, well, this is fine. Your path is just as good as mine, is really doing a disfavor.
Yeah.
So that's why I ended up starting being more vocal about these things, rather than just kind of be the same way to honeycoat everything.
Fantastic. And obviously, we're really grateful that you have, and it's led to Garuda Prakashan and other fantastic feats. So, yes, we have this comment. So, perhaps, Sankrantji, you can just tell people, where can they find out more about Garuda books, and how do
Sure,
they
sure.
find out more about you as well on Twitter? What's your handle, that sort of thing, please?
Absolutely, absolutely. So the website is garudabooks.com, GARUDA books.com. And please go there, please order books. It's very important. It's very difficult for a small publishing house to survive. We don't have any big backers, we don't have any funders. It's all being funded by me currently still. Every month I'm writing a paycheck out to the staff. So buying the books, spreading the books is very, very important. And even international readers, you can join our Book of the Month Club, where we send our best book every month. Just go to the WhatsApp number, which is on the website, garudabooks.com. Tell them you want to sign up for Garuda Club. They'll help you sign up. If you're in India, you can just go there on the website and find it. My Twitter ID is at Sankrant. I'm quite active. Also, sankrant.org is my personal website. So yeah, feel free to be associated and ask your questions. Come and I'm quite active on Twitter, so if you want to have a dialogue, discourse, debate on anything, I'm always open. And yes, I see Garuda Books as um, is a civilizational task. We have to have our own platforms to tell our own stories in our own words without having to sugarcoat them. So, and it flies on blessings. So, I ask you, Melissa, to bless us and all your readers and listeners as well, so that we can carry on this Dharma task.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sankrantji, for joining today. That's been, I can feel that we were completely on the same wavelength on this issue about the English language. So that's been really fantastic to hear your perspective, because obviously I'm coming from the Western perspective and you're coming from the Indian, the Hindu perspective and seeing it that way. You described how actually perhaps because you said earlier that maybe you were previously more secular minded and you've been traveling a lot, so that maybe contributed to you then being able to see some of these problems like almost like from an outsider's point of view, like I have, because I'm coming at this and seeing this and thinking, this doesn't make sense.
Right.
Whereas if you're within it, maybe you're kind of stuck in this sort of group think, and that's how you've been raised to see things and not really realize that things don't make sense. What you're saying is not logical.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Everyone's saying it, so you carry on saying it, right? I guess.
Yeah, there's a lot of things in the Indian system, now, especially because, after spending half my life in the West and coming back and having both the perspective of living here and living outside. I mean, if you look at the ways the laws are set up in India, it's absolutely absurd. No other country does it this way, where you have the majority of the country being completely discriminated against legally. We can't control our own temples, we can't run our own schools. Anywhere else it would be completely absurd, but for some reason in India they think this is secularism, which is not the way secularism is practiced anywhere in the world. But we've been kind of just indoctrinated into believing it. So it's good for us to challenge it, and you're doing a great job on that as well, Melissa.
Thank you very much. So yes, everyone, thank you so much for joining. It's been a fascinating session. I hope you've learned a lot. I can see some people have answered my question about the Mundan Sanskar. So thank you very much. Sorry, separate from what we've been just discussing, Sankrantji, I was asking at what age to perform my baby son Hiramba's Mundan Sanskar. So thank you for those answers. And yes, please do follow Sankrantji. Go on to garudabooks.com and please like this video, subscribe to my channel as well, and share this video if you found it really interesting. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you again, Sankrantji, and namaste. Namaste.
Namaste.
Jai Shri Ram. Jai Shri Ram.